Some stories are written in ink. Others are written in the hearts of millions. A boy from a small English town. A voice that would fill stadiums. A face the world couldn't forget. In 2013, another story began. Not on stage, not in the charts, but online. A love story, a storm, a phenomenon. It wasn't officially about him, but fans knew, or thought they did. A fictional boy, a real man. Two names whispered together. What happens when the lines blur? When a living, breathing person becomes a character millions love and hate? This is Harry Styles. This is After. And this is the story bigger than the page.
Please don't push me away.
I love you.
Holmes Chapel, Cheshire, England. A small and peaceful village surrounded by green fields, winding roads, and familiar faces. The kind of place where everyone knows the sound of your footsteps, and where a trip to the shop often turns into a conversation with 3 different people before you make it back home. On February 1st, 1994, a baby boy entered that quiet world. His name was Harry Edward Styles, and though no one could have known it then, this child would grow to be one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Harry's parents, Anne and Des, gave him a warm and loving start to life, but when he was just 7 years old, they separated. It was a change that could have made him bitter, but instead, it seemed to deepen his understanding of people, of their emotions, and of how fragile connections can be. In later interviews, Harry would speak fondly of his childhood, saying, "I had a great childhood. I feel very lucky for that." And it was clear that even through changes and challenges, he always carried a sense of gratitude for the love that surrounded him. At school, Harry was known for his charm and humor. He was the boy who made people laugh in the middle of a dull lesson, the one who could light up a room just by walking into it. He played football with his friends, told silly jokes, and seemed endlessly curious about the world.
In the studio here on Twitter, what is going on there?
There's me. I look at his end just staring at him.
But there was one thing that set him apart, something that even then hinted at what was to come: music. The Styles household was filled with it. His mother, Anne, played everything from Fleetwood Mac to Norah Jones, and the warm, familiar melodies drifted through the rooms like sunlight through the curtains. Harry's stepfather introduced him to even more records, sparking a fascination with voices and songs that carried emotion like a secret. In the privacy of his bedroom, Harry would sing along, testing the limits of his voice, not for an audience, but for himself. By the time he was 14, Harry wasn't just singing alone. He had become the lead singer of a local band called White Eskimo, performing at small school events, pub gigs, and even weddings. The audiences were small, sometimes just a handful of people, but for Harry, it didn't matter. He later said, "I loved it, the feeling of being on stage, even if it was just in front of 20 people. It wasn't about fame, it was about the music, the connection, and the rush of performing." Outside of music, Harry worked a part-time job at the local bakery in Holmes Chapel. He made sandwiches, served customers, swept the floors, and learned the art of conversation from behind the counter. People who came in for bread and tea would leave with a smile, remembering the polite and funny young man who served them. Even then, Harry had a way of making people feel seen. But as much as Harry loved his small-town life, there was a restlessness in him. He wanted to see more, to do more, to push beyond the quiet boundaries of Holmes Chapel. And in 2010, when he was just 16, an opportunity appeared that would change everything: the X Factor. He walked into the audition room wearing a white shirt, his hair slightly messy, and his nerves barely hidden behind a shy smile. When he sang Stevie Wonder's "Isn't She Lovely," his voice was soft and sincere, filled with the warmth that would one day make him famous. Simon Cowell wasn't entirely convinced at first, but there was something undeniable about him. Harry didn't win that day, at least not on his own, because fate was about to rewrite the script. The judges decided to put him together with 4 other boys: Niall Horan, Lewis Tomlinson, Liam Payne, Zayn Rawlick. 5 strangers, one group, a new beginning. They called themselves One Direction. From that point on, Harry's life became unrecognizable. The bakery shifts were gone. The small gigs and local pubs were replaced with screaming arenas and flashing lights. The boy from Holmes Chapel was now part of one of the biggest pop groups in the world. Fans noticed Harry immediately, the curls that framed his face, the dimples that deepened when he smiled, and the way he treated everyone around him with kindness. He wasn't just another boy in a boy band. There was something different about him, something that drew people in. In those early years, as One Direction's fame exploded, fans began creating stories. They imagined meeting Harry, falling in love with him, or watching him navigate a fictional life. Some of these stories were innocent and lighthearted. Others were dramatic, intense, even romanticized versions of a man they'd never met. At first, these works lived quietly on platforms like Tumblr and Wattpad, read by a few hundred people at most. But the community grew. And somewhere in the middle of it, a writer named Anna Todd began crafting a story that would one day capture the attention of millions. Harry didn't know it yet, but the seeds of After had already been planted, and soon they would grow into something much bigger than he or anyone else could have imagined. From the moment One Direction stepped onto the X Factor stage as a group, something clicked. They didn't win the competition, in fact, they came in third, but they left with something far more powerful than a trophy, an army of devoted fans. The kind of fans who would follow them from TV screens to arenas, from music videos to every corner of the internet. One Direction's debut single, What Makes You Beautiful, wasn't just a hit, it was a global event. It shot to #1 in the UK, breaking records and sparking a wave of pop mania that hadn't been seen in years. For Harry, it was the start of a whirlwind. In less than a year, he had gone from serving sandwiches in Holmes Chapel to performing for tens of thousands of people each night. The band's schedule was relentless, tours across Europe, America, and beyond. Album after album, each one selling millions. Photo shoots, interviews, award shows. Every moment was documented, dissected, and shared by fans around the world. And in the middle of it all, Harry Styles began to emerge as something more than just 1/5 of the group. He had the smile that made headlines, the easy charisma that made interviews unforgettable, and the fashion choices that hinted at a bolder, more experimental side. Fans noticed the way he moved on stage, confident but not arrogant, playful yet sincere. It was a combination that felt rare, even in the world of pop stardom. The internet magnified everything. Every glance, every laugh, every lyric became a GIF, a meme, or a post on Tumblr. Harry's relationships, his tattoos, his clothes, all became part of a larger conversation. It was here, online, that another phenomenon began to grow alongside the band's official success: fan-created worlds. Fanfiction had been around for decades, but the One Direction fandom took it to new heights. These weren't just short stories, they were sprawling narratives, sometimes hundreds of chapters long, written by fans who felt connected to the boys in ways the real world didn't allow. Harry, with his charm and mystery, quickly became one of the most written about members. In these fictional universes, he was everything from a kind-hearted boyfriend to a brooding, misunderstood stranger. The possibilities were endless, and the boundaries between fact and fiction began to blur. One of the reasons Harry inspired so much writing was his ability to keep a certain distance from the chaos. He was open in interviews but never too revealing, honest yet careful about which parts of himself he shared. This left space for imagination to fill in the blanks. Fans could project their own stories onto him, creating versions of Harry that were entirely their own. By 2012, One Direction had become the biggest boy band in the world. The tours were bigger, the crowds louder, the stakes higher. Harry embraced it all with an ease that made it look effortless, though behind the scenes, the pressure was immense. He was learning to live under a microscope, to navigate fame while still figuring out who he was. And while the real Harry was traveling the world and making music, somewhere on the other side of the internet, a young writer named Anna Todd was typing away at a story on Wattpad. A story that would take inspiration from his image, his tattoos, his presence, his magnetism, and transform it into a fictional character with a very different personality. That character would be called Hardinscott, and soon the name would be known by millions. But before After could take off, the world needed to see just how big Harry Styles had become. Because it wasn't just a book about a boy in a band, it was a book about the boy in the band, at least in the eyes of the fans who read it. It began quietly, no press release, no publisher, just a laptop, an internet connection, and a young woman with a story in her head. Anna Todd was a 24-year-old from Texas. She had never published a book, she had no agent, no formal training in writing, and no grand plan for fame. What she did have was Wattpad. Wattpad was a free online platform where anyone could write and share stories. For many, it was a place to pass time, to experiment, to create without rules. But for Anna, it became the place where an idea inspired by Harry Styles, would grow into a phenomenon. She began writing in 2013. The story started as a casual project, something she posted chapter by chapter, without editing, without overthinking. The main character, Hardinscott, was tall, magnetic, and tattooed, an instantly recognizable silhouette to anyone familiar with Harry's real-life image at the time. His messy hair, his British accent, his air of mystery, it was all there. But this wasn't the Harry Styles fans knew from interviews and concerts. Hardin was different. He was moody, unpredictable, at times cruel, a walking storm of contradictions. The story paired him with Tessa, a driven and innocent college student whose world was turned upside down by Hardin's presence. The plot was raw, messy, and full of drama. Arguments, reconciliations, love, betrayal, it played out like a soap opera for the digital age. And the readers couldn't get enough. Every time Anna posted a new chapter, the comments poured in. Fans would debate what Hardin's next move would be. Some loved him fiercely, others hated him, but they kept reading. In less than a year, After had become Wattpad's most read story. By the time the first draft was complete, it had over 1 billion reads. 1 billion! Numbers unheard of for an unpublished work. For readers inside the One Direction fandom, the connection was obvious. Hardinscott might not have shared Harry's name, but his appearance, his tattoos, and even certain mannerisms were unmistakably inspired by him. Fans who adored Harry brought that affection into the story, giving Hardin a kind of built-in mythology. But there was another side to the reaction. Not everyone was happy to see Harry's likeness tied to such a volatile character. Some fans worried it painted an unfair, even damaging picture of him. They feared that people unfamiliar with Harry's real personality would assume the fictional traits were somehow real. Harry himself never publicly addressed After directly, but he did speak, in general, about fanfiction. In one interview, he said, "It's strange, but it's flattering. People can do whatever they want with their own imagination. As long as no one gets hurt, I think it's fine." It was a diplomatic answer, the kind that gave nothing away, but avoided stirring the pot. As After exploded online, it also began to spill into the real publishing world. In 2014, Anna Todd signed a book deal with Simon & Schuster's Gallery Books. The story that began as an unpolished online draft was re-edited, rewritten, and released in print. The physical book flew off shelves, reaching readers far beyond the One Direction fandom. What had started as a niche fanfic had transformed into a mainstream bestseller. And yet, at its core, it still carried the DNA of Harry Styles, or at least the Harry Styles as imagined by millions of fans in the early 2010s. The lines between reality and fiction were blurring faster than ever, and the next step would take the phenomenon off the page entirely and onto the screen. From the beginning, the heart of the After phenomenon was a paradox. It was a fictional story, but it felt real, too real for some. Fans who knew Harry Styles, or at least knew the public version of him, could see the pieces that had been borrowed for Hardinscott. The tattoos, the accent, the way he carried himself. These were the details that made the character leap off the page, but they also tethered him to a living, breathing person. And Hardinscott was not the kind of boy most parents would want their daughter dating. In the books, he was volatile, brooding, and sometimes manipulative. The romance between Hardin and Tessa was passionate, but filled with conflict, arguments, and cycles of hurt and reconciliation. For many readers, it was thrilling. For others, it was alarming. Critics accused After of romanticizing toxic behavior. They pointed to Hardin's jealousy, his mood swings, and the ways he would push Tessa away only to pull her back in. They worried about the message it sent to young readers, that love could be chaotic, that emotional turbulence was proof of depth. In the middle of it all was Harry Styles, silent but present in the conversation whether he liked it or not. He had never endorsed the story, never claimed it, never spoken about it in detail. But his image was there in every fan's mind when they read about Hardinscott slamming doors or whispering apologies. Some fans rushed to defend him, reminding others that Hardin was a fictional character, shaped entirely by Anna Todd's imagination. Harry, they said, had nothing to do with the personality on the page. Others argued that his likeness made it impossible to separate the two completely. They worried that new readers, unfamiliar with Harry's true nature, might think the book was revealing hidden truths about him. It was an unusual problem, the collision of celebrity culture, fan creativity, and mass-market publishing. In interviews, Harry kept his answers broad when asked about fanfiction. He once said, "People write stories, people draw pictures, people make what they want. That's their right, and it's flattering in a way. But I'm just me." It was clear he had no interest in feeding the speculation. But the public fascination grew. By the time the first Afterbook was published, Harry's own career was evolving. One Direction was still together, but the cracks were starting to show. The boys were older, more independent. Rumors about a possible hiatus were already circulating. And all the while, After was becoming a cultural touchstone. It wasn't just a fan fiction anymore, it was a bestseller, translated into multiple languages, discussed in book clubs, adapted into fan art, and endlessly debated online. To its supporters, it was an addictive, emotional roller coaster of a romance. To its critics, it was a dangerous example of how fiction could influence reality. For Harry, the truth was simple. Hardinscott was not him. But for the millions of people who had read the book, the resemblance, whether intentional or not, was impossible to ignore. The question was no longer if the story would move beyond the page, it was when. And that moment was closer than anyone realized. The leap from book to film is never simple. It's not just about translating words into images, it's about reimagining a world that readers have already built in their minds. And with After, that world was deeply personal to millions of fans. When the film adaptation was announced, the internet lit up. There was excitement, curiosity, and plenty of skepticism. How would they capture Hardinscott's intensity? How would they portray the fiery, complicated love between Hardin and Tessa? And most of all, would it still be tied to Harry Styles? The answer, at least on paper, was no. By the time the cameras started rolling, the film's creative team had made a decision. This was no longer fanfiction. The character of Hardinscott would no longer carry a physical resemblance to Harry Styles. No British boy band backstory, no direct nods to One Direction. Instead, Hardin became his own fictional entity, still moody, still tattooed, but officially disconnected from Harry's likeness. Hero Finds Tiffin was cast as Hardin. Josephine Langford played Tessa. The story remained, the romance, the drama, the emotional turbulence, but the link to Harry had been scrubbed clean, at least in theory. In practice, the shadow of Harry Styles still lingered. For readers who had been there from the Wattpad days, the connection couldn't be erased. They still remembered the early drafts, the descriptions, the tiny details that had made Hardin feel like Harry in another life. The film might have taken away the visual similarities, but the DNA of the character still carried echoes of its origin. When After premiered in 2019, it opened to a mix of reactions. Fans of the books were thrilled to see their favorite moments on screen. Critics were less impressed, calling it predictable, overly melodramatic, and emotionally thin. But the numbers told a different story. The movie was a modest box office success, especially overseas, and its performance was strong enough to justify sequels. Meanwhile, in Harry's world, everything had changed. One Direction had officially gone on hiatus in 2016, and Harry was stepping fully into his solo career. His self-titled debut album had already marked a dramatic shift in sound and image, drawing inspiration from classic rock, folk, and soul. He was reinventing himself, musically, visually, and personally. The timing created a strange kind of parallel. As Hardinscott's fictional life was being played out on screen, the real Harry Styles was finding his voice as an artist, completely separate from the phenomenon that had borrowed his likeness. While the After films leaned into angst, conflict, and chaos, Harry's music embraced vulnerability, warmth, and self-expression. The split between fiction and reality had never been clearer, and yet, For those who had been there from the beginning, the connection would always remain part of the conversation. The question now was how Harry himself would continue to grow, and whether the world would ever fully separate the man from the character he had unintentionally inspired. By the time the first After film premiered in 2019, Harry Styles was already deep into the second chapter of his career. The boy who once stood shyly on the X Factor stage was now a solo artist with a clear vision, a bold aesthetic, and music that felt entirely his own. In 2017, his debut album, Harry Styles, surprised many who expected a safe, radio-friendly pop record. Instead, it was a blend of rock, folk, and introspective ballads, music that nodded to the greats while carving out a space for Harry as a serious artist. Songs like Sign of the Times revealed a new depth, a willingness to slow down, to linger in emotion, to push against the boundaries of what people thought a former boy band member could do. By the time his second album, Fine Line, arrived in 2019, Harry had fully stepped into his identity. The record was colorful, vulnerable, and unapologetically personal. Tracks like Adore You and Falling showed both his joy and his fragility. It was clear that Harry's art was no longer about chasing trends. It was about telling the truth as he saw it. Meanwhile, the After series continued to grow on its own path, releasing sequels and deepening its own fictional world. For many of the original readers, Harry was no longer at the forefront of their minds when they thought of Hardinscott. The films had built their own identity, separate from their Wattpad roots. But the connection, for those who remembered, was still a quiet echo in the background. Harry, however, seemed to live entirely apart from it. In interviews, he focused on his music, his acting, and his values. Kindness, inclusivity, and self-expression became the pillars of his public image. His fashion choices challenged gender norms, his stage presence celebrated freedom, and his words encouraged fans to embrace who they truly were. This was not Hardinscott. This was Harry Edward Styles, a man defined not by a fictional character, but by the art he created and the way he made people feel. And yet, the after chapter of his cultural footprint remains a strange, almost mythical footnote. It's the kind of story that feels too big to erase, too intertwined with the internet's history to ever completely fade. For some fans, it's a nostalgic memory of the early One Direction days. For others, it's a reminder of the blurred lines between reality and fantasy, and how celebrity can be both a canvas and a mirror. Yet, the after chapter of his cultural footprint remains a strange, almost mythical footnote. It's the kind of story that feels too big to erase, too intertwined with the internet's history to ever completely fade. For some fans, it's a nostalgic memory of the early One Direction days. For others, it's a reminder of the blurred lines between reality and fantasy, and how celebrity can be both a canvas and a mirror. Harry himself seems content to let it live in the past. He has never needed to correct the record, never felt the urge to rewrite the story. Instead, he's chosen to keep moving forward, album to album, show to show, moment to moment, building a legacy that exists entirely on his own terms. By the early 2020s, with Harry's House topping charts and his acting career taking shape in films like Dunkirk and Don't Worry Darling, it was clear that the man once linked to a fictional anti-hero had far outgrown the shadow of After. The music, the artistry, and the kindness had become his defining features. And for those who still remember the connection, it's simply one chapter in a much bigger, much more beautiful story. Some stories belong to one person. Others belong to all of us. The story of Harry Styles and After has never been simple. It began in a small village with a boy who loved music and dreamed of more. It grew into global fame, into arenas and albums, into millions of people finding comfort, joy, and inspiration in his presence. Somewhere along the way, that boy's image sparked another creation, a fictional character whose world exploded far beyond the corners of the internet where it began. It was never truly Harry, but it was shaped by the way people saw him, by the space he left for imagination. And that's the thing about stories. Once they're out in the world, you don't control where they go. They take on a life of their own. They change. They grow. They become something different in the hands of each person who reads them. Harry has spent the last decade proving who he really is, not through explanations or defenses, but through action, through music that opens doors, through kindness that inspires, through a refusal to be boxed in by anyone else's idea of who he should be. In the end, the line between Harry Styles and after will always be there for those who want to see it. But maybe the point is not to erase it or to sharpen it, but simply to understand it. To see that behind every character, every projection, every myth, there is a real person, one who lives a life far richer than any fiction. As the lights fade and the credits roll, we're left with one truth. Harry Styles is not Hardinscott. Harry Styles is Harry Styles, and that is more than enough.
You're one of us. Stay curious, stay brave. Like, subscribe, and never miss a twist.